Philippine President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. called for unity as he was sworn in today in the wake of politically divisive elections last month. He has also sworn in his cabinet. The inauguration was met with celebration by his supporters and protests by his critics. Buena Bernal reports.
Philippine President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. said in his speech that there is hope for reconciliation, but his detractors are urging him to apologize for the atrocities committed during the presidency of his late father, Ferdinand Marcos Sr., who ruled the country for 21 years, 14 years of which were under military rule marred by widespread human rights violations and the torture of thousands of dissidents. In his inaugural address that lasted under 30 minutes, Mr. Marcos Jr. cited as pressing issues of the day agriculture and food security, climate change and plastic pollution, basic education, healthcare, and the plight of overseas Filipino workers, among others. He also says he will lay out his plans for the country during his State of the Nation address scheduled in July. Now, he also praised the presidency of his father, saying that his father got things done. Mr. Marcos Jr. urged Filipinos not to look to the past, but to the future. His supporters, who viewed the inaugural address in key viewing areas via LED screens surrounding the National Museum, also echoed his call.
Daming bumabatikos kay Bongbong Marcos, wala. Ang sinisigaw niya ay unity, magkaisa po tayo.
Protests have erupted nationwide at Plaza Miranda, a historic site where a fatal bombing killed 9 protesters in 1971, and that was part of the justification for martial law in 1972. Over 100 protesters showed up today, and they were rejecting the leadership of Mr. Marcos Jr. Mr. Saturo Campo, a former legislator and an activist who authored the law that provided reparations for human rights victims under martial law, said that Mr. Marcos Jr. should acknowledge those atrocities in order for the nation to heal.
No, we cannot move on. We cannot go into, I suppose, unity without rectifying the errors of the past.
Before his oath-taking, Mr. Marcos Jr. met with his predecessor, former President Rodrigo Duterte, at the Presidential Palace, Malacanang, and headed here at the National Museum. He took his oath of office here, which is a sentimental building for him. This is the Philippines' old legislative building, and his father was a former legislator before becoming president. The group campaigned against the return of Marcoses and martial law, said that Mr. Marcos Jr.'s inauguration rites are beyond overkill, citing the at least 15,000 uniformed personnel and force multipliers deployed around the area of the National Museum, the Grand Military Parade, and the number of dignitaries in attendance. Mr. Marcos Jr. is the first Philippine president to win by a majority vote since democracy was restored in the Philippines after his father's ouster. Buena Bernal, CNA, Manila.